I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm reposting an episode that I did 3 years ago, one of my earliest, called Sam Harris and the War on Burqas. This was in September of 2021, and it was based on an interview that Russell Brand did of Sam Harris 3 years prior to that, called Is Islam or Consumerism the Greatest Threat to Freedom? I rephrase that as capitalism, not consumerism, and I also combine it with another Russell Brand video at that time called Is Feminism Being Used to Enable the Afghan Clusterfuck? At that time, the difficulty was that the war on terror was losing steam. People were no longer as pent up about it, and so they needed to boost it, and they did that by saying, oh, hijabs are horrible. Women should never have to wear burqas. And they got all this righteous indignation about it. I think today we're in a similar situation where the war against the Middle East is very unpopular. And Israel, backed by the U.S., is doing the most unconscionable things. And so they need to cloak this. So once again, it is being resurfaced that against Lebanon and Iraq and Syria and Iran, that look at what they do to women. In this case, I think that looking at the philosophy of things like humanitarian intervention and going into the details of why it is that we think we're morally superior and have that right of humanitarian intervention or of charity, and both being ways that we take away the sovereignty of another person, that we see them as morally inferior, and therefore we are imposing something on them that takes away their humanity. So I think it's worth listening to this because I go into a lot of detail about the philosophy. Let's do this. I'm Teresa Caraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today I'm going to be talking about Russell Brand's interview of Sam Harris. This is an old one. This is number 45. What is the greatest threat to freedom, Islam or consumerism? I'm going to be rephrasing consumerism as capitalism because consumerism is more an individual choice of what to buy, whereas capitalism are the constriction of choices in terms of how we can live, how we can enable ourselves to be able to have the necessities of life. And so I want to look at that in particular because Sam was an early apologist for the war on burqas that Russell talks about in his recent podcast, his recent YouTube, which is, did liberals use feminism as a way to justify the Afghan clusterfuck? So for Sam, I think this is a really important thing to be able to deconstruct his logic and figure out where it went wrong in order to enable his moral rationale to have been used in order to justify this kind of violence that we know now was intentional propaganda. We know from WikiLeaks, as Russell has talked about, that this was a strategy in order to get people on board because enthusiasm for the war on terror was waning after such a long time. And so burqas and feminism was the new rallying cry to get people to change that to humanitarian intervention and once again distract us from looking at corporate profits and how that figured into all this. So let's look at that, and I also want to look at rephrasing the title of the YouTube for Russell, that I think he's saying, have liberals used this, is too broad of a term. I think elites is too broad. 1% is too broad. Really, we're talking about a handful of people who are pulling the strings. And these are the ones who in feudal times would have said, your labor belongs to me because the land belongs to me. In our case now, this is the bankers. This is the bankers and the way in which they control all of our labor by controlling the properties by issuing those mortgages. And so if you want more details on that, look at my episode on Edward Snowden, The Greatest Conspiracy in Plain Sight. But we need a word for those people. We don't have one. So I'm going to use oligarchs, but I welcome Russell to come up with something better, because we need to be able to talk about a specific group that is not going to include all the rest of us who are essentially being manipulated and fooled. So let's look at how this moral rationale was made by Sam in his discussion with Russell. Something that Sam talks about is dogma. Now, I think we always need to define our terms. So I define dogma as a belief which someone is not willing to raise to question. I don't think dogma is a bad thing. I think we should all have beliefs that we're not willing to raise to question, but I think we should own them. The liberation theology had a perspective that said everyone has a bias. The important thing is to be able to own your bias. So their bias was, as they called it, a preferential option for the poor. In my case, I have only one dogma. My dogma is that all people are born morally equal. And I am not willing to raise that to question. Sam does not have that particular dogma. He says that he thinks 1% or less are born as psychopaths. And so for those people, he believes in his own moral superiority. But for everyone else, he says that it's a plan of incentives, that how they are is because of some kind of system of incentives. On that, I agree with him completely. So if we're all born morally equal, then how someone behaves is a result of their circumstances after birth. And so when I look at someone who I consider to be behaving badly, I have to say, what would cause me to do the same in their circumstances? I can't just dismiss it as, oh, I could never have done that. So the example that Sam gives of dogma and how a dogma can be dangerous is that he looks at something that he says on the surface, this seems like it would be harmless. The dogma that all life is equally valuable and that life begins at conception. Now, he says that this is a dangerous dogma because then it impedes things like embryonic stem cell research. I think it's interesting that he doesn't consider the example of women having control over their own bodies, since that seemed to be the rationale he's using for the invasion of Middle East countries. But whatever, in this case, he looks at that as being dangerous. Now, I think that it is an obfuscation to conflate the belief that all life is equally valuable and life begins at conception. But both of those together wouldn't be dangerous without a third and fourth, which is that we are morally superior in that belief, and we have the right to impose that belief on others. Sam, I think, shares those last two that make a dogma dangerous, that he believes that there is a moral superiority to the way that he thinks, and he thinks that that should be able to be imposed on others. So in that sense, he's the same as the right to lifers. It's just that he has a different dogma. And his dogma is looking at not being motivated by religion, but being motivated by a secular concept, which could be capitalism. So let's examine that more closely. Another thing that Sam talks about is moral relativism, and he rejects it, and I share his rejection of that. So what's the opposite of it? The opposite of that is to say that there are absolutes to what should be considered good and bad. So how do we determine what that spectrum is? The way that I look at that spectrum is that I think that to do good is to alleviate suffering. I think that to do better is to enable people to alleviate their own suffering. I think that to do bad is to cause suffering, but to do evil is to force others to cause suffering. If we look at the system of capitalism, it's something that puts us in a position where causing suffering may be the only way to make a living. So let's look at Sam's example of something that is religiously motivated, which is suicide bombers. We've recently passed the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and I was having dinner with some friends that night, and I brought up the question of whether it was possible that our government was complicit in that act. One gentleman in particular was adamant that there was no way that our government or anyone in it could be so evil. So I asked him, how is it possible for other people from other countries to be so evil? And he said, religion. They are motivated by religion, and that's what allows them to do something that is so evil. This just happened to be someone who was a project manager for a defense contractor who made bombs. So since 9/11, there have been nearly 1 million people who have been killed in the global war on terror. By my calculations, that's 33,000 for every one person that was killed on 9/11. So if we're not going to accept moral relativism, then we need to look at all life being equally valuable. And so killing 33,000 people is 33,000 times more evil than killing one. So why is it that we don't question whether that act could possibly be evil? We see that as a perfectly rational thing, as a means of caring about your own family, about your neighbors, about your country, because it's motivated by a paycheck. And something motivated by a paycheck or something motivated by profits isn't raised to that same scrutiny. Only something that's motivated by religion. If it were my kids who had been killed by a bomb, I don't think I would care whether the motivation was money or religion. And when we look at the money, there has been a recent book out by William Engdahl called Prophets of War, and that's prophets with a PH, not an F. And that looks at how much money has been made by defense contractors in these last 20 years. So another example that Sam gives of morality and how different religions have different levels of morality is when he talks about Palestinians. And what he says is that Christian Palestinians are not suicide bombers, and therefore their morality of their religion is better than the Muslim. And so from his perspective, what he says is, this is true even though they are both equally oppressed. Let's examine that. So, because one religion enables people to be themselves oppressed, have all of their neighbors and family and country be oppressed, but not do anything about it, to not respond, to not be willing to put their own lives in danger, but to go along with it and to be submissive. Is that a higher morality than someone who fights back? So I think that's a very convenient way of looking at it for any empire. I think all empires would like their colonies to have an ideology of being passive, but it also completely ignores Israeli violence. That doesn't even exist in his example. So why don't we look at violence that's motivated by profit and paychecks and money to be something that is in the same, being able to be raised to scrutiny as we do religious or ideological violence? This is something that needs to really be examined right now, because Sam says that he believes that all people all lives have gotten better over the course of history, that's self-evident. But Russell says, I think we need a truthful metric by which we measure that. So when I look at the metric, I think Russell talked about it in the title. We're talking about freedom. We're talking about the ability to make your own life better. And Russell, in his YouTube video, mentions the brilliant article by John Pilger on Afghani women and how much better off they were before the U.S. introduced the Mujahideen that then had the reaction of the Taliban. So Afghani women were doing a fine job of enabling their own freedom and their own happiness and taking control over their own lives. We did not help that. And so words matter. This rationale that Sam has been a proponent of has given a way to be able to disguise the level of violence that's happened in the Middle East. And it's given us a way of being willing to go along with it and not really look at it. And I think that what that goes back to is his dogma, that the dogma of moral superiority and how something that is motivated by money is not the same as an act that is motivated by ideology, that those are things that have allowed us to participate in atrocities. No matter what it is we do in this country, we're still paying taxes, we're still participating in these atrocities. We do not have the right to do no wrong. And having an ideology that allows that is, I think, the most dangerous thing that we can be doing. Thank you. To follow up on this, here is another of my earliest videos that I think is worth another watch, which is the 3 greatest conspiracies in plain sight on Edward Snowden. And then this is a more recent one called The Dogma of Atheism that looks at how atheism and religion both share a belief in moral superiority. They just call it evil or psychopaths. Thanks for watching.